Hello everyone. So for today's class, we're going to be talking about teratogens. Now, what exactly are teratogens? If you look at the definition that's put forth in your book, a teratogen is any chemical substance that may cause harm during the prenatal period. Now we'll very briefly look at some examples of teratogens, and then later we will discuss their impact or some of the several impacts that they might have, right? So anything that can cause damage during the prenatal period is called a teratogen. Certain examples of teratogens include something like alcohol. So if the mother consumes alcohol, that can have negative impacts on the development of the baby. Then it can be something like drugs. Now, these include prescription drugs, so, over the counter medicine, even, and certain non prescription or illegal drugs, such as marijuana, such as heroin, right? Then we also have the impact of something like radiation, right? So, even radiation can cause harm during the prenatal period. What else might you have? You can have something like environmental pollutants, right? Those are also teratogens. So we'll discuss each of these and some more in a lot more detail as we move along. But before we do so, one of the things that we see is that the impact of these teratogens, right, is mediated by a couple of factors. What we mean by that is that how much harm a particular teratogen is able to do is dependent on these particular factors. And the first of these particular factors is the dose, right? So the dose that is administered to the growing fetus or the growing baby, right? That depends on, that has a significant impact on the kind of damage that will be done, right? So how much damage is done? So if you, for example, when we have something like alcohol, right? So if the mother takes in a lot of alcohol, right, that will have a different impact than if she has slightly lower levels of alcohol. Same is the case with drugs, right? Same is the case with something like exposure to radiation. So dosage is one very important factor when we're talking about the harm that teratogens can do to the developing baby, right? The next factor that we consider is something that we call heredity. Now, what do we mean by heredity? Now, what you see is that certain individuals have certain genes, right, that protect them from the harmful effects of certain teratogens, right? Whereas certain other individuals have genes that make them more vulnerable to the harmful effects of those teratogens. So the kind of heredity that you have will also play a role in how much damage a teratogen is able to inflict during the prenatal period, right? The third factor is the presence of other negative influences, right? So sometimes it's not that, there's just one teratogen that is able to inflict harm during the prenatal period. It's rather a combination of factors, right? So it's basically that, you have certain genes that predispose you. Then you also have exposure, right? Then you also have something like that the mother is extremely stressed, right? Then you could also have something like that, nutrition is poor. So there are a couple of other factors that also decide how much harm a particular teratogen will be able to inflict during the prenatal period. It's not just, we cannot just say that, this harm was there because of cocaine usage or because of alcohol usage, because there are always a variety of factors that go hand in hand, right? So, the presence of other negative influences or other negative factors will also play a part in how much damage a particular teratogen is able to inflict. Last but not the least, we have age, right? And this basically refers to the age of the developing organism, so the developing baby. Are you talking about the period in which the baby is still a zygote, right? Or are you talking about a period in which the baby has now become an embryo, right? Or are you talking about a stage where the baby is now a fetus? Sorry, let me just correct the spelling here. Because the zygote is extremely, it's a, whereas when we talk about the embryo, right? One of the things that we talked about when we saw the embryo was that this is where the foundations of so many different body parts and organs are being laid down. And if it is at this point that there is exposure to any kind of teratogen, then that damage will be something that will be long lasting and that will harm the organism, the development of the organism in very significant ways. Whereas when we look at the fetus, right, we see that there is still harm that's possible to certain organs. For example, harm to the genitals is possible, harm to the eyes is possible, but it is much more minimal than what we have during, sorry, what we have during the embryonic stage, um, because what you see is that during the fetal stage, a lot of development has already taken place. So with if you have exposure during the fetal period, which is this last period, then you can have negative impacts on the genitals, brain, and the eyes. But most damage occurs during the embryonic period, right? Now, let me just show you how each organ reacts differently to exposure of teratogens. Like, at what stage are they most sensitive? You see here with this diagram is that during the period of the zygote, which is here, right? You see that usually the zygote is not susceptible to teratogens, but if there is significant damage, that will lead to prenatal death, right? However, if you look at the embryonic period, and here let me show you basically what's happening. So these are the different kind of, systems that are developing in different organs, right? So here you see the development of the central nervous system. Now the blue bars indicate sensitive periods. Now sensitive periods are periods wherein a lot of damage is possible if there is exposure. The green bars, they basically show, which is the part here, this is something you can see, they show slightly less sensitive periods. So what you see here is that, during the embryonic period, the heart, let's look at the central nervous system first. The central, this is, for the central nervous system, right? This horizontal bar here, right? And what you see is that for the central nervous system, the embryonic period is very critical, and so is the fetal period, right? Part of the fetal period till you reach around 16 weeks. For the heart, the sensitive period, the very sensitive period, extends from the embryonic period till around 6 weeks, right? For the upper limbs, it's shorter, so it doesn't really extend to the fetal period. For the eyes, you see that there is an extension of a lesser sensitive period into the ninth month, so till the baby is full term, right? Same is the case with teeth, same is the case with external genitals, right? With palate, you see that major development of the palate starts happening midway during the embryonic period, right? And here you have basically, when you look at this part of the diagram, you have what is developing when during the prenatal stage. And therefore, if there is damage during any of these stages, what will happen is that that will impact that particular part of your body, right? So here you have by 9 weeks you have major developments in the brain, and therefore if there is any kind of teratogen and exposure to it during this period, that will result in brain damage. So basically what you see is that during the embryonic period you have major structural abnormalities resulting as a result of exposure to teratogens, whereas during the fetal period you have physiological defects and minor structural abnormalities, whereas in the period of the zygote you have prenatal death, right? So I hope that that clarifies it. Next, what we're going to look at is the effect of particular kinds of teratogens. So firstly, we talk about prescription drugs. Now, one of the problems is that, the effects of prescription drugs on prenatal health or on the health of the developing organism were not always known. So during the 1950s and 60s, a particular prescription drug, which basically what it did was that it protected against miscarriages, right, was administered to women. It was prescribed to them. And what they did was when they took this drug, later, if they had, especially if they had girls, right, when these girls reached puberty, a lot of times they developed certain problems. Like, so for example, they had a greater susceptibility to developing something like ovarian cancer. So this particular drug called dithylbistestrol, so this is basically how you write it. Sorry, dithylstilbestrol, right? What it did was that it caused a lot of damage to these women's fetuses in ways that was apparent or became apparent after they were born and after they reached puberty. Then there are other drugs which may cause damage to the central nervous system, which may cause damage to the brain. Drug known by the name of thalidomide, right, is basically a sedative, right? And if taken by pregnant women, it causes deformities of the limbs, right? It causes damage to the heart, right? So a lot of different negative effects of taking something like a sedative, right? Such as thalidomide, right? When we come to talking about dithylstilbestrol, again, one of the things that we saw was that it caused damage to women's babies in ways that if they were girls, they went on to developing something like ovarian cancer. What it did was that if the babies were boys, right, they also developed cancers of, for example, the testes, right? So in girls, it was ovarian cancer. So it was basically, their genitalia which was damaged, right, in both cases, right? With something like thalidomide, you saw that there was much more frequent chances of damage to the arms and legs, but less frequently to the heart and to the lungs and the genitals as well, right? Then you have cases of drugs like there is a very popular drug apparently in Canada and the United States, which is by the name of Accutane, which is basically used to treat acne, right? And this is taken by women in hundreds and thousands of figures, right? And one of the things is that if women are exposed to this drug during their third trimester, right, so this can cause a lot of damage to the growing organism. And this damage is basically so widespread that it can go from the eyes, ears, there can be damage to the skull, the brain, right, the heart, and the immune system. Sorry, I just said that if taken during the third trimester, so that's wrong. If taken during the first trimester, so Accutane has the most impact if it's taken during the first trimester, right, of pregnancy. And you have some research that even implicates as something like aspirin, right? That mothers who took aspirin very, very regularly had children who had lower birth weight, and that's one of the things that we see, that lower birth weight is correlated with a lot of negative outcomes, right? Such as lower intelligence, such as later heart problems, such as later diabetes. So basically, women who took aspirin extremely regularly also had chances that they would have children who would have lower birth weight, who would score lower in intelligence tests. But research on this is kind of mixed. So yeah, so these are certain prescription drugs and the effects that they can have during the prenatal period on the developing organism. Now let's consider the effects of illegal drugs. And when we talk about illegal drugs, we basically talk about something like marijuana, we talk about we talk about cocaine, right? And we talk about heroin. Sorry. Now, one of the first things is that um, children who are born of mothers who who basically took in these illegal drugs or who consume these illegal drugs are born drug addicted, right? Therefore, when their temperaments are basically extremely irritable, right? They cry a lot more easily, they are less attentive to their surroundings, they are harder to console. So what that does is that also has their behavior, which is basically that they're irritable and they are less easily consoled, also has an impact on the kind of parenting that they receive or on the kind of caregiving that they receive. Obviously, if you have a child who is extremely difficult to parent, that's going to have an impact on how well you're able to parent as well. So, this is where we sort of also look at bi-directional effects, right? So basically, because the mother consumed these drugs, she could have consumed cocaine or heroin or methadone, which is um, a slightly less hard drug, which is sometimes used to wean people off heroin, or, for example, something like marijuana. So what happens is that, these children are usually born as drug addicts themselves. So they're addicted to the substances that their mothers were consuming, and which makes them more irritable, less responsive to the environment that they're in, and that also has an impact on the sort of parenting that they receive, right? When we talk about the effects of cocaine, there's a lot of sort of mixed research on this, because certain researchers claim that there are no effects that you find really of women who consume cocaine, whereas others say that there are a host of different problems that can happen because of exposure during the prenatal period. And these, again, can include something like low birth weight, death at the time of birth, then later sort of intellectual deficits. Likewise, we have similar findings with something like heroin, right? That there are a host of different problems because what some of these drugs do is that they constrict oxygen supply to the brain, right, when a woman is pregnant. And when you cut off oxygen supply or when you limit oxygen supply to the fetus, right? Sorry, I think I just said brain, but basically what they do is limit oxygen supply to the fetus, right? What happens is that there is a high chance that there will be damage to the developing organism and to especially the brain of the developing organism, amongst a host of other organs and systems that will be damaged, right? So basically, especially with cocaine, this is something that you see that because it constricts the blood vessels, so the oxygen supply is something that is affected, and that results in a lot of different abnormalities in the developing organism, right? Now, next, we have something like the effect of tobacco. Now, even though it is widely understood that smoking is something that can harm um, a developing fetus, a lot of mothers still continue to smoke, and even if they're not smoking themselves, they might be smoking passively, right? So they might be around a husband who smokes or around a around a partner who smokes, and that is basically where they're inhaling the smoke themselves. And another, again, what we see is that when there's consumption of tobacco, right? So again, there is the same kind of problems that there is low birth weight, there might be problems with, there might be abnormalities with the brain, there might be lower intelligence, right? So you have all of these issues again with something like smoking. Like smoking, you can even have higher chances of infant death, right? And if the child survives, and there can be chances of later behavioral problems, right? Now, next we talk about the effects of alcohol. And what you see is that with mothers who consumed alcohol, right, there can be two possibilities. So, one is that they give birth to children who have something that's called fetal alcohol syndrome, right? And if they consumed alcohol in smaller quantities, then they have something which are called fetal alcohol effects. Now, what are differences in these? Fetal alcohol syndrome, what you see is that there may be abnormalities with something like memory. Children born have problems with memory, they have problems with attention, they have higher chances of mental retardation, they have impaired motor coordination, right? And they also suffer from overactivity. And they have also, in addition to all of this, they also have certain distinct physical characteristics. So they grow very slowly, their rate of growth is slow, and they have these physical features, so even facial features, which are distinct. Now, let me show you what these look like. Children who have fetal alcohol syndrome, so their mothers drank heavily during their pregnancies, and what you see is that they have these distinct features in that they have these widely spaced eyes, they have these thin upper lips, right? And they also have these very short eyelid openings, right? Sorry for deforming the pictures here. But yeah, so these children also have these distinct physical features. Now, when we talk about fetal alcohol effects, these are basically when the mother drank in lesser amounts than what the mother did in the case of fetal alcohol syndrome. But so these children who have fetal alcohol effects will have lesser problems than those who have fetal alcohol syndrome. So they might have some of the issues. So they might have, let's suppose, issues with memory or attention, but they will not have the full range of the problems that we've discussed with fetal alcohol syndrome, right? So the problems are lesser in intensity and they're also lesser in the range of problems that you have with something like fetal alcohol syndrome. So what you see is that even with these children who have fetal alcohol effects, they do not do, as well in school, and they also suffer from, some kind of brain damage. Because what happens is that alcohol has this effect on the production and migration of neurons inside the brain. And in that way, it severely affects the structure of the brain and how it functions as well. And therefore, what you see is that it's not safe to drink alcohol during pregnancy at all, right? Next, we have something like exposure to radiation. And what you see is that with radiation, even sometimes small amounts can have, quite large effects, can result in many abnormalities, right? So with radiation, what you see, and the most sort of, the most tragic examples of these are seen in places like Chernobyl, where there were nuclear explosions, right? Or, sort of radiation leaked. And what you see is that children who are born around the time have many structural abnormalities. And these are not just with their bodies in the sense that they're not just born with a missing limb or a few missing limbs, but they also have damage to the brain. So here, what you see is that this is a child whose mother was just a few months pregnant at the time of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. And what you see is that there's clear abnormality with the limbs. And it's not just that this child has limb deformities, but he'll probably have linguistic delays and intellectual deficits as well. Extreme case in which we have something like a nuclear leakage or a nuclear explosion. But even with something like radiation from X-rays, when you get an X-ray from a broken bone, even that can result in significant deformities during the prenatal period. It can result in something like development of certain kinds of cancers in children. So radiation, which is sometimes even leaked from industrial plants and not nuclear plants, and in the form of X-rays as well, is also extremely dangerous. Next, what we talk about are environmental pollutants and infectious disease. But because we are running out of time, I'll just switch to another video and we'll talk about the effect of these two kinds of teratogens in the next video.